How Philanthropy Can Influence Public Policy is, as you know, the name of the session. That's why you're here. This is a topic, I think, of increasing, intensifying interest to a lot of both donors and donees. At the Fordham Institute in Washington, where I mostly work, we do education policy, and we found ourselves dragged deeper and deeper into advocacy in recent years. In our case, particularly over academic standards and charter schools and school choice issues, but that's our field. We get dragged in deeper partly because public policy making has grown so contentious, and that field has grown so large and so fraught, but it's also been, I think, since we keep finding that people who don't want to do what we would like to see done are gearing up to do more and more advocacy. And I do believe there is a bit of a advocacy arms race underway, at least in the education space. I strongly suspect this is true in other spaces as well. In addition to all the philanthropy history and fantastic examples that Carl was just running over at considerable length in the other room, the philanthropy really does have a long history of public policy influencing. And there's actually another very useful roundtable book from a year or two ago called Agenda Setting, A Wise Giver's Guide to Influencing Public Policy. There's copies in the back of the room. Thank you. Take one. It's not, first of all, it's not as long as Carl's new book. And secondly, it's really very nicely done. And the second half of it consists of examples over 130 years of philanthropy influencing public policy in all sorts of ways that you might not have thought about. It goes back to the 1833 and the Anti-Slavery Society. Philanthropic activity that obviously took 30 years, but I'd say eventually had a considerable influence on public policy. 1958, a prototype for the Peace Corps, started by philanthropy. The 1982, the Federalist Society was born, and it comes on, of course, into the present era. So there's a lot of background on this topic to the role of philanthropy in influencing public policy. Nobody should think that this is a issue of the last 5 years or the last 10 years. But we're here to talk about its ups and downs, its goods and bads, its successes and failures. And we've got two veterans of this world joining me on the panel. Gara and Gerard are so well biographed in what you've got that I'm not going to waste their time on introductions. You can read about them. If you want to read more about Gara, by the way, he's also profiled in this book I just held up about agenda setting. And when the second edition comes out, I have no doubt that Gerard will be profiled there as well, especially after this morning. Let us, and we are going to proceed with a conversation format. I'm going to start by hurling some questions at them, some of which they heard about ahead of time, and then we will draw you all into the conversation as we go forward. But no speeches other than what you just heard. So let us go, gentlemen. What's the difference, other than tax exemption, between public philanthropy-based, public policy philanthropy and political giving? Is there a material difference, or is it just an IRS difference? Gara, you want to start?
Well, I've worked for, first of all, thank you for having me here.
Of course, thank you for being here. I should have said that sooner.
Glad to be back at the Philanthropy Roundtable. I Googled Gerard this morning, and I saw that he'd written a piece called "Why Are Liberals So Condescending?" I want to say that is the most stupid headline I've ever. No, I'll try not to be an example.
Writers do not write their own headlines.
That's true.
I'll try not to be an example of it this morning. So, I worked for a guy, George Soros, among other places, who was both as was mentioned by Carl in the presentation this morning in the Bosnia work, both very philanthropic in the kind of, if you will, the charitable way, and also in public policy and politically. Although I hasten to say, work for him on the political side. So he decided, as some on the right have also decided, to be both philanthropically active and also politically active. What's the difference? I actually think that one difference is that, many people are led to think, okay, we don't like the way the policies are going. We ought to get different politicians. We'll give contributions to candidates. And that's, our American right to do so. Not for me to judge that. I do think that philanthropy, public policy philanthropy, is more aimed at at holding politicians accountable. At both giving politicians policy directions to follow and influencing public policy in that sense, but also invariably, on the left and on the right, politicians disappoint. So whatever people's activity in the political sphere, I think if you're concerned about changing policy in whatever direction, public policy philanthropy that is invested for the long haul in whether it's social movements or think tanks or legal groups or whatever, to hold the political sphere accountable is a much better long-term investment.
Gerard, is that your take on it as well, this distinction?
I'm going to nervously start by saying I think I agree with everything Garrett just said.
Everybody go to another panel.
All right. I would make one distinction, though, and that is that there has been so much change in recent decades on both not so much political giving as into campaigns, directly to political campaigns or super PACs or other things, but C4 giving and to public policy philanthropy, that I would say that the two can be very different, but they can also in many, many instances be quite similar. All of us probably in this room have at least been approached by people who are both, for instance, in the C3 and C4 business simultaneously, and who at noon are supposed to take off one hat and put on the other, walk to the desk across the room and suddenly start doing C3 work, and that's all tax deductible. They sit down with their lawyers and carefully plot out which bits of their operations can be safely put onto the C3 tax deductible side of the ledger, and so on. And so in that sense, there are cases in which I think the distinction is really only a legal one. It's not really a particularly substantive one.
Is it an archaic distinction?
No, because there can be a profound distinction, and I think that does speak to what Garrett just referred to.
I guess what I was trying to address in my comments was more electoral giving versus philanthropy. I wasn't really talking about the C3, C4 distinction, which is significant for the reasons you mentioned, but not electorally political.
Okay. Right. No, but fair enough. But I would make it. The reason I bring the C4s into it is what was different about public policy philanthropy was it was about building voices, constituencies, organizations that endured from election to election, that could hold politicians' feet to fire. Right. The only reason I brought up C4s was to point out that in recent years, C4s in many cases have swallowed the pill of the need for permanent infrastructure, start to use that language, and have also tried to build out more permanent organizations and presences. So even there, I think, even in terms of the accountability, that line has somewhat blurred. And I don't doubt that at some point as a society we need to devote some scrutiny to that.
So, brief audience survey. How many of you are involved in some way with a C3 of some kind? Raise hands. Okay, thank you. Second, how many of you are involved in some way with a C4 of some kind? Raise your hands. So maybe 20% of 30% of those in the room are involved, I'm going to say, with both, because you're not supposed to be here if you have no C3 involvement at all. So let's say maybe a third are involved with both. So is it important to be involved with both these days, gentlemen?
Well, look, I think if you have a policy agenda, if you want to promote charter schools or marriage equality or whatever the cause might be, there is a good reason to be involved in the C4 side as well, because there's a somewhat different array of tools available to you. So I think that, there's a lot, as we can discuss or will discuss, and as I think the book probably also suggests, that can be done to influence public policy on the C3 side. So it's not a question of either or. There's no distinction between, kind of purely charitable. And I think Carl was very right this morning in answering some of these arguments that are sometimes made dismissing the value of charitable, of traditional charitable giving. So it's not that the only way to play in the public policy sphere is on the C4 side, but that, you can do certain more, and I think if you're really serious about it, you probably want to have both vehicles available to you.
Let me just repeat what you just said. If you're really serious about it, you want to have both vehicles available to you. Do you agree?
Probably. The political science professor side of me can't help but speculate about whether that's changed and why it might be that we find ourselves exactly where Gara describes. And here's my best sort of tentative swing at that. For most of the the first half of the post-1945 period, America's national parties, and hence its party politics even down to the state level and even lower, involved overlapping parties. It was well known that you had, liberal Republicans in substantial numbers who were to the left on many issues, if that was the right, if we, want to use that crude left-to-right spectrum, to the left of many Democrats and vice versa. In that age, in that environment, someone who's pushing a specific public policy agenda, whether it had to do with education or economic reforms or trade policy or you name it, could seek to, through public policy philanthropy, support researchers in an area, support publications of various kinds, could try to develop ideas, research their, to develop their credibility and persuasiveness, and try to inject them into policy debates. And you never knew where supporters from that might come from. They might come from either party. You never knew from what quarters. People in different in either of the parties or both could take sort of a sense of ownership of it and run with it. Famously, since the 80s and 90s, that's much less the case. I don't like the word polarization when it's applied to American politics to mean the sense that we're moving away from the center. That's true in some ways, but not in lots and lots of others. But we are more polarized in the sense that American politics is now much more organized around two political party poles, and there is vastly less ideological overlap between them than there was for so long. To the point where now, famously, your leftmost Republican senator is still well to the right of your rightmost Democratic senator, for example. And in that world, it is much more difficult for someone, unless they have one of the truly nonpartisan or bipartisan policy issues, it is much harder to simply throw an issue out there and hope that someone will listen, because the chances are good that only one person, so to speak, is likely to champion it. Another might well have a sort of chemical allergic reaction to it, a tribal reaction that that's not our issue, that's the other side's issue. In which case, it has become more true than it was until at least the 1980s, that today, if you want your policy issue to thrive, there's a very good chance that your team, quote unquote, has to be in office in order to do it. In which case, you really you feel invited, I think, now to care about electoral outcomes in a way that wasn't as intensely the case in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s.
But can I just use an example from my own life? So I wasn't always in philanthropy, thank God. Before that, I was in nonprofits that raise money from philanthropy, and I started my career in the American Civil Liberties Union. So the American Civil Liberties Union is almost 100 years old, and it is, from the beginning and still to this day, primarily supported by small individual donations. And the people who join the American Civil Liberties Union do so without any expectation of a tax benefit, right? So at some point over the last 100 years, they created a C3 arm of the ACLU, and that supports, I don't know, pamphlet or litigation, but a lot of what the ACLU does in community after community around legislation, which is, by the way, not invariably left or right. So you're right about the polarization of electoral, and it's probably true that these days that ACLU has a harder time being, more bipartisan. If you take criminal justice issues, which are on your agenda during the course of this conference, there's a substantial amount of overlap, between the Coke industries on the one hand and the ACLU and some people on the other hand. And so, but a lot of what that involves on a legislative by legislative basis is lobbying and taking positions on legislation. The tax laws, that we're talking about probably were written in 1920. I don't remember when the distinction came into being, but it seems to me obvious that if you want to affect public policy in a direct way, it is good to be able to do it with C3. The other thing that with C4, and the other thing that's packed into that, I think, which is something that we'll talk about as the discussion proceeds, I think, is that an organization, in my view, that has a broad base of donors who are and not dependent on a particular donor has a lot more flexibility, to do its business without having strings pulled. And I think that whether it's the ACLU, and I'm sure there are examples on the right, that broad base of donors who are not primarily drawn or incentivized by the tax incentive can give you a great deal more flexibility both with respect to policy and program than dependency, which has become the norm on the left and probably creeping in that direction on the right, on a handful of big funding sources.
Yeah. So on this archaic question, if the tax code that we are talking about is in its essence pushing 100 years old, does it need to be revisited with respect to these distinctions, or we just leave it the way it is and work with it the way we've been doing?
Can you imagine the lobbying effort that would pour forth if that really was opened up, right? I mean, it's just
advocacy.
Right? There'd be advocacy over what the rules should be about tax treatment of advocacy, right?
As there are with all tax reform bills,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Okay. But just pushing one more time, we're accustomed to this distinction, and I'm simply asking whether you think it's an obsolete distinction or dysfunctional at this point in time, or are we living with it satisfactorily?
Look, I think that I'm a little conflicted on the issue myself, frankly, because I think that it gets to the question of what does a tax exemption mean? You know, if a tax exemption is viewed as a form of subsidy, which is the way the left tends to think of it, and the right probably less so.
Irving Kristol didn't agree with that.
Yes, but if it's viewed as a form of subsidy, then what you're doing with a tax exemption is kind of privileging a certain point of view. So that the argument goes that the government is in effect kind of speaking or endorsing through the tax deduction. So the line that we draw about taking a position on legislation and influencing politicians is a line that comes in part from that distinction of not wanting to have, in effect, a government subsidy for a particular kind of speech. So that's a complicated issue, and I come out of a free speech background, and so I've grappled with it. I guess it's such a. It seems to me. I'm a little taken aback by the question only because it's not really a live political question at the moment.
I'm trying to enliven it.
A blue sky, it's kind of a blue sky thing, and I will think more about it.
God forbid.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
All right.
Yeah, I agree it's complicated. My fear is that this is one of those things, the legal distinction between what's, for instance, C4 and what's C3 activity, that however imperfect the current rules, that doesn't mean that they can be improved upon. So, for instance, we don't doubt that there is C3 activity that is in no way political enough to warrant treatment different from charitable activity. If you simply support someone working as a researcher at a small think tank that's not very partisan involved on something like criminal justice reform, working for years, working those vineyards long before the political process takes an interest in it and runs with it, you don't want to deprive that maybe of charitable status. On the other hand, as soon as you invent any distinction between C3 and C4 activity, you're going to find activists, fundraisers, and lawyers working right up to the margin of that. You know, it's like saying if enough people drive 55 and that's not 54 and that's not safe, should we? Is there any point having a speed limit? And the answer is, it doesn't matter where you put the speed limit. You'll have lots of people driving right up to it. That it might well be the case with this sort of law that people are going to work their way right up to what's legally tolerable, no matter where you draw that line.
Well, in the speed limit sense, it's right over it.
Well,
but yeah,
I was being generous.
Within 5 miles of the speed limit, and you're okay. Yes. I think that probably goes on in the C3 world when it comes to advocacy, too. Within 5 miles of the speed limit, before you worry that somebody is actually going to give you a ticket. So if you look at this from the sort of larger point of view of what's good for democracy and good governance in a free society like this, our large philanthropic contributions to public policy. I'm not talking about the mass support of the ACLU. I'm talking about the multi-million-dollar efforts by individual donors or companies or whatever to shape public policy. Is this good for democracy and good governance? Go ahead.
Garrett has written and spoken about this eloquently already. I've read some of his own things on this. I encourage you.
And he's obviously read some of yours.
And he may well extend that line of reasoning today. I would only say that it's going to sound odd at first, but I just don't know that it's an issue, that it matters whether it's either a a beneficial or threatening thing for democracy, public policy philanthropy. I say that not because it probably couldn't be teased out or we don't care about democracy, but only because it's a bit to me like free speech or voting. If I told you that over the next 25 years, voting rates in America might go from 50-60% to 95%, and asked you if that was a good or bad thing for democracy, well, the fact is there have been democracies in the world that have broken down under the weight of people voting for parties that were not themselves committed to democracy. I assure you, if voting rates went to 95% in this country, that would mean bringing into the political system voices that I would cringe at hearing, voices that Gara would cringe at hearing, and yet I don't
More
think...
likely that I would like to hear.
No, I actually think that's a long-time confidence that left has had that I think is probably not warranted. I think that there's lots of cringeworthy politics out there, not always articulated, and we would not, I think, ask ourselves, is that good for good governance? It was simply voting, like free speech, is simply a thing that either you have a normative commitment to or you don't, and it simply has come to the territory.
Well,
and if you
wait, you leave your analogy and come back to large philanthropic gifts to public policy.
Unless you're going to do something like ban philanthropists from supporting things like research, how in the world would you restrict it? I mean, in other words, it doesn't matter whether public policy philanthropy is good or bad for democracy. I simply don't see a way that you could ban it without such a revolution in our procedural norms, one that would be so violating of
So it is what it is.
It is what it is. Just like free speech is what it is, even when it's awful speech.
Gara?
Well, I guess I probably come out where you just came out, but it is true that that I have in the last couple of years since leaving the leadership of a couple of large foundations, during which period of time, as the CEO of these places, I presided over maybe $3 billion of philanthropic expenditures, mostly aimed at changing public policy. And I do have some disquiet about it, but my argument was addressed to my fellow liberals, really. Not so, and it goes as follows. We're conditioned to be distrustful of large aggregations of power, particularly large aggregations of money in the political process, right? And the right, not necessarily monolithic, doesn't have that same conflict. But progressives do. We're trying to get big money out of politics and, small donations, and we don't like, a handful of or the big piece in the Times this weekend, the front page about how relatively few families, control the giving to our politics. So I was having an argument in effect with myself as somebody who's been like a professional redistributionist, but also to my fellow progressives. Why are we so suspicious of large aggregations of money and their influence on the political process, but we tend to suspend that when it is Bill Gates or George Soros or whatever, Koch's accepted. So, and I think that's something we have to grapple with, and I think that some of the reasons have to do with the way philanthropy, the power that philanthropy has by virtue of the fact that people are gatekeepers to money. So people tend not to speak ill of their donors or their prospective donors, and I was trying to work some of those issues out for myself. It doesn't lead me toward a policy, a ban. I don't think there's any practical way to do that. Just on other free speech issues, while I may dislike hate speech or sexist speech or whatever, I can't conceive of a way to deal with it that isn't worse than the problem itself. So it doesn't lead me to a ban. It does lead me to want to raise those questions, at least as a discussion among progressive philanthropists, and I think I provoked a lot of discussion with it. And also that leads me to the other thing we were talking about, which was more is better, right? So the democratization of philanthropy and greater small giving will be a bit of a counterweight. Do I think that Gates, for instance, has a very heavy foot on public policy in certain areas, or maybe Soros in a different area? Yes, I do. And does that give me some disquiet about democracy? Yeah, it does. But I don't know. I haven't worked out the policy aspects of that for myself.
Okay, let's segue from that into a contentious current issue, which is whether these gifts should be disclosed or anonymous. There's been a lot of talk lately about whether gifts to C3 organizations all have to be reported on anybody's disclosure forms. A lot of giving is done anonymously. and has been that way for a long time. Some have, I think, including Gara, have been advocating sort of total disclosure of who's giving to what. Advantageous or not to insist that everybody's support of everything be known by everybody?
I spoke last. So.
He's got ice in his mouth. Go ahead.
As a general rule, I don't see why disclosure is, as a general matter, a bad thing. On the other hand, the main reason to want disclosure is so people can look it up, right? In other words, disclosure is important because you wanted, for instance, in the case of political candidates, to know who was funding them so you can judge to what extent their positions might be influenced by their supporters or their donors. So the whole point of disclosure, it's meaningless unless the notion is that not only could people in theory scrutinize the records, but that some people will. And my, therefore, one concern about that is, as in so many public policy issues, I worry about it when there is a serious asymmetry in politics. Is this going to affect adversely one side or another in American political debates and on the political landscape? And my suspicion is right now, yes, it is. Disclosure could be more hurtful to lots of friends of mine than to adversaries on the other side of the philosophical aisle, and that's because I think there's a very asymmetric politics of kind of outrage and anger in American politics. I'm very prepared for Gara to disagree with that, but I do think, for instance, that it's much likelier that people could be intimidated into not donating to conservative causes than could be intimidated into not donating to liberal.
You mean if there were full disclosure of all donations?
Right. Find me vilification anywhere near on the scale there is to the Koch brothers on the left, and I'll tell you that this
Soros has come in for some of it.
Soros has come in for some, and yet, rare is the case when show me a raft of new academic books, have a conversation with journalists about money and politics. Hold up. I mean, I bet you, for instance, to this day that I would be very curious to see the results of a poll in which conservative, let's say Republican, local activists were aware of Tom Steyer's name versus Democrats aware of Charles Koch's. There's just a level of moral outrage. Let me give one quick example. And I think this is, it's not just an example, I think this is the reason, that one of the major reasons underpinning this asymmetry that at least I see in American politics. There is a very strong tendency among progressives and liberals to accuse conservatives of acting in bad faith. And I think there's a much, much lesser habit on the right of doing that to liberals. Now, let me give one example. In recent debates perennial debates over minimum wage, the general accusation by conservatives is that raising minimum wages to very high levels is punitive, it's bad for business, but is also bad for lots of intended beneficiaries. You price lots of young people, especially out of labor markets. Milton Friedman said decades ago that a high minimum wage was one of the most effective anti-black policies he could imagine in
anti-black policies.
Anti-black policies in America. And the general argument, therefore, is that this is meant in earnest good faith to help the working poor, and is in fact perverse in its consequences by hurting them. Notice the tone of debate among liberals about conservatives who oppose the minimum wage hikes. It is that they're anti-worker, they don't care about poor. It's all about evil intentions. Now, those do not generate two similar reactions in public policy conversations. One is about our malevolent adversary. The other is about our misguided one, or one who's just wrong about the facts. When one side thinks the other is acting in good faith but is misguided, the other thinks that they're actually evil in many ways. Those do not generate similar dynamics. And disclosure rules in that climate do not generate similar dynamics.
So I think I hear you saying that, to oversimplify, that total disclosure would end up being bad for conservative causes more than it would be bad for liberal causes.
Now, that's not necessarily a reason to oppose it, but I also don't doubt that there are a bunch of progressives who support disclosure because they want to use exposure as a blunt instrument to discourage.
Okay, Gara's turn.
Well,
disclosure.
We'll get back to the original question, but I have a hard time thinking that in a country where the United States Senate and House and Supreme Court and all but 7 states are controlled by conservative Republicans, that victimization is the rule. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I don't. Each side. I come from the left, right? So we have a deep investment in our own victimhood, and I watch with some amusement. Conservatives,
feeling victimized,
doing the same thing. Everybody wants to be victims. So, on the basic question of disclosure, again, I'm a little conflicted about it. I run an organization that his tax status is designed to prevent the forced disclosure of the members. The Democracy Alliance is an organization different but similar in some ways, Philanthropy Roundtable, which is of progressive political donors, or people who want to build an infrastructure on the progressive side so that progressive values can take hold in American politics. And obviously, we haven't been doing such a good job of it, from my point of view, in recent years. But it was set up so that the donors are not disclosed. I'm uncomfortable. This is another example where I think there's a bit of hypocrisy on the left. I'm uncomfortable running an organization that's deliberately untransparent. And we have tried to move the Democracy Alliance to a more transparent position. I mean, in the past, when we tried to be secretive about it, the Washington Free Beacon, hung around and, tried to, pull documents out of the garbage and so on. So they became public anyway. So now all of our strategies, all the groups we support, we're being very public about. And the donors, we're trying to make sure that the donors, most of the donors don't actually care about anonymity. The ones who do, frankly, do so not for any nefarious reason, and I think there are people on the other side of this table who will identify with this, but because they don't particularly want to be heightened prey for people, trying to get money out of them, right? There's occasionally a family reason, where somebody comes from a very conservative family and it's going to be very complicated. But by and large, my bias is toward disclosure. But there is a long line of free speech cases in this country that people like myself have generally supported on the grounds that you mentioned. Let's leave aside for the moment who's more victimized in American society right now. But that disclosure can result in retaliation, right? NAACP versus Alabama and so on. So I think that liberals, there's a general bias towards transparency, but there's also a countervailing value in people being able to take an act, that doesn't visit retaliation about them. Let's leave for another time the question of how in contemporary American politics that would work out and who would be discriminated against. So I think there has to be some room. When you have, there are two different issues here, by the way. One is the largeness of contributions. Does something by its very size distort the political process or the philanthropic process? And a cure to that, it is thought, is that if you know about it anyway, if you know that Marco Rubio, whatever it is, gets a disproportionate amount of his money from, I can't remember the name of the guy in Florida, he might be here, I don't know, or Sheldon Adelson or whatever. If you know about that, you can factor it in. If you don't know about it, then the democracy is impaired a bit. At least that's the way the argument is going.
I should note that in this roundtable book on public policy advocacy, the profile of Gara starts by saying he leads America's savviest network of large-scale liberal policy and politics donors. So the roundtable is admiring of what he has been about. So I'm hearing both of you actually being conflicted or of two minds on this disclosure question. Let's do another audience survey. Question being, should all charitable contributions have to be disclosed as to who or where they come from? Those who think that that would be a good thing in American society, kindly raise your hands.
Jeez. Well, there you go.
Those that have reservations about whether
That's
it would be a good
democracy.
thing, raise your hands. Okay, I guess we got a bunch of secretive people in the room.
They refuse to answer that question.
They refuse to answer that question lest we disclose who they are in responding to the question. All right. But this, I gather, and I'm not a close follower of this, but I gather that this issue of disclosure has gravitated in large part into the states rather than into federal law, and that it's become an issue with state attorneys general in some states.
Though Lois Lerner was
right?
doing her best.
She is. She was. But am I correct? This is something that comes up as a state attorney general kind of concern? And how does it play out? What does a state attorney general do to bring about greater disclosure if that's what she wants to do?
You're going to know that.
I don't know.
You don't know how that works.
I'm not that.
All right?
It's my understanding, for instance, that in California, just by regulatory rulings, they just don't have the same privacy protections awarded by federal law. But it's my understanding that that's right in New York, there, and a few other places. There's been more movement towards disclosure than I've heard anyone ask for at the federal level.
Yeah.
Okay. Adam.
Let me just quickly answer that question. When you send
There's a mic.
when public charities send their when they send to the IRS their 990 forms, the Section B, which Schedule B, which includes the donor information about top donors, that is redacted out of from public view. And the IRS has strict statutory prohibitions on on sharing that information with just about anybody. And now these growing number of state attorneys general, including in New York and California, are requiring that any public charity that does business in those states has to file their 990, including the Schedule B. And they don't have those statutory prohibitions protecting the privacy of the donors. So that issue is now being litigated in the courts. But what that means is that the Attorney General of California, if she wishes, could share. Currently, if a public charity supplies its charitable information, she can share that with anybody now without any prohibition on that.
So the information is in the 990,
It's in
but
the
the
990.
IRS cannot disclose it.
That's right.
Okay. There seems to be an urgent hand just to your right. Do you want to hand the mic to someone whom I can't see?
Request the Schedule B from the IRS.
They can't give it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. We will persevere. Okay. What are some successes and failures in this world of philanthropy, philanthropic efforts to influence public policy, and what kinds of mistakes get made by philanthropists that want to use charitable money to influence public policy? Tell us some successes, some failures, some triumphs if there are, and some catastrophes if any. But what goes wrong in this work?
Well, I'll start. I mean, the two questions taken together are very large, but so successes. I'll start out with the right. I'm a big admirer of a lot of the way the Olin Foundation went about its work, and Jim Pearson, who may be in the room or not, I don't know. I teach a class at NYU in philanthropy and public policy. I always have him come and talk, and I've done an interview with him in the Open Society Foundation. We've done a lot of things together over the years. We don't agree on almost any policy issue, but I think Olin is a good he also ran one of the most significant spend-down foundations, before Atlantic Philanthropies, which I was the president of, which is almost spending down the largest foundation in history to spend down. So I think that the creation of the Federalist Society, for instance, or if I look at the Bradley Foundation's work to push school vouchers as a public policy issue, and the way those things got put in the map, and the creation of significant parts of conservative infrastructure like the Federalist Society or like the Heritage Foundation, which in some respects the organization I run was created to try to catch up to. Right?
Be the antidote to.
Right, exactly. So we took a page from the right in the work that they had done in the policy sphere, and I think that there's been a significant impact from those two foundations, such as I have mentioned. I think the two that I have worked for, also have some things under their belt. I think the fact that we have a national debate about mass incarceration and the costs of the drug war owe a lot to the work that we did starting 20 years ago at the Open Society Foundation, when almost no foundation on either side of the spectrum was concerned with criminal justice issues. Now you have a significant, I think, right-left alignment around at least some of those issues. Some of it is fiscal conservatism, some of it is evangelical Christians who are concerned about redemption, some of it is skepticism about big government doing anything, but all of that aligns, not completely, but substantially. And I've, in addition to supporting a lot of progressive organizations doing criminal justice work, civil rights organizations, and so on. We also gave grants to Cato and other organizations on the right that were doing criminal justice work. So I think that the Soros contribution to the drug and crime debate has been quite significant. And I think the in a related sphere, when we were at Atlantic, we gave some of the early grants on the overuse of school disciplinary policies in public education and the expulsion of a lot of Black and Latino kids, particularly disproportionate amounts of suspension rates. So I think those are a few successes. There are historic ones that I teach about, like the 9/11 system and public television, if you think that's a success, or the Green Revolution.
You mean 911 system, don't you?
911, did it?
9/11 is a different
I'm sorry,
connotation.
yeah, right, sorry. 9/11, right. The same number of digits. I mean, you get the same result if you put it into the telephone, but yes. 9/11 was not caused by philanthropy that I know of, although there may be people in this room who think so. But now mistakes are myriad, right? And but I'll
just give a few.
Yeah, but I'll just. Well, and I'm going to talk less about a particular mistake than I want to. Well, the two things. Causality is very difficult when you're talking about advocacy, right? So I'm sure this is not going to be a popular statement, but the foundation I headed, Atlantic Philanthropies, is widely viewed as having played a significant role in the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And we put $26 million into, over a period of years, advocacy at the grassroots level on behalf of the Affordable Care Act. It passed. Does that mean Atlantic is responsible? I don't know. I mean, we could make a case that, as close as it was, a lot of the advocacy that we were able to support helped. But I think where you're talking about public policy victories, the impact is rarely so direct as what was being mentioned before with Gates and 8 million lives, or with Soros saving lives in Bosnia. When you're talking about policy, there are a lot of players. Causality is a much more complicated issue. The biggest mistake that I think is made is really a bigger philanthropic mistake generally, and that is when foundations do two things. When they have a short-term, they expect results too soon, and then they pull out. So any significant public policy change is likely to be something that you have to stick with over a period of time. And to get to the place we are in criminal justice today required the seeding of fellows and think tanks and all kinds of things that have come to fruition before it was at the center of the public debate. And somebody who wants to get results tomorrow and then pull out and declare victory is not likely to be a very successful public policy philanthropist. And the other thing that's done that's a mistake, and the left certainly does it, and I don't know as much about the right, is thinking of yourself as the center of the movement and having all of the expertise. So it's a particular disease among progressive or centrist foundations now, with the metrics, movement and all that, to think that they are the architects of a public policy change, hiring grantees to carry out their work. I think a better model is, in general, for almost any philanthropic enterprise, is to find good people who know what they're doing and back them and let them be in the lead. And I think the tendency toward micromanagement and a kind of a stifling approach to grantees, which I see a lot of my colleagues doing, is not, in my view, a very good approach to public policy. And I think if you look at good foundations like Olin and be very impactful, you will not find that kind of relationship with the grantees.
But the donor knows best, or the foundation is the strategist or the driver of the train, is an increasingly widespread phenomenon in American philanthropy. Certainly is in my world.
Yeah.
Gerard?
Let me echo a couple of things Garrett just said, or several of them. One is that the issue of patience. Absolutely right. For one thing, the public policy process is its outcomes are determined by the interaction of many, many players. Mentalities have to shift across time. Gary was describing cases in which ideas spend years in the wilderness before they're finally accepted, and that's just, it comes with the territory. On the issue of micromanagement there too, I think it is a complicated line to walk for every donor. On the one hand, if you knew better than the people actually in that field, then you should be running it yourself, and if you're not going to do that, then you shouldn't micromanage. On the other hand, what is the suggestion? That you have no knowledge, that you shouldn't steer that money as intelligently as possible, that you shouldn't call a failure when you see one and direct your resources to something. Your judgment clearly is worth something, and it shouldn't be dismissed either. And so, but how you choose to walk that line, Gary is simply alerting us to the fact that it's often walked on the side of, not only do I know best how to use my money, I also know best how to do your job, and that can be a very unhelpful combination of things. But the thing I'd like to most return to that Gary mentioned, and this, don't worry, we'll come back to successes and failures.
Please.
He said that causality is complicated. So let me make a very quick distinction between, it's a distinction that Gary has made himself elsewhere, between sort of palliative or traditionally charitable activity and public policy-oriented activity. On the one hand, Gary, and like many others, in fact, quite possibly everyone in this room, there has been the notion that treat a symptom of some problem, and you've only treated the symptom. You have to keep treating it as long as it keeps getting generated by some underlying cause. Isn't it better to try to cut the Gordian knot and solve the underlying problem? And that's often not always a public policy issue. And I appreciate the notion that by striking at the public policy issue and not just treating things palliatively, it can be ultimately more efficient. You can have more beneficial effect on society. And I get all of those arguments. On the other hand, if the last 50 or 60 years have taught us anything, it's that the causality issue is central. When you're doing something purely palliative, setting up a soup kitchen, your goal is to make hungry people less hungry, and on the one hand, you're only treating a symptom. You're not addressing why they may be homeless, why they may be malnourished, why they're very poor and don't have access to food or healthcare or education or whatever it may be. On the other hand, there's a pretty straightforward connection between you putting the soup out there and a belly getting full. You can be pretty sure that you may only be treating a symptom, but you're actually treating it. When even palliative care is scaled up enough, things can get more complicated. We learned the hard way, who would have thought, that large-scale famine relief turns out to be more complicated. Deliver tons and tons of free food to countries in famine, and instead of just helping, you can actually really mess up what embryonic food markets and recovery of them are underway there. You can discourage food production, whatever is going on, instead of helping, and thus famine relief operations have actually become much more subtle. They often send in food but actually sell it for modest prices rather than giving it away, so as not to undercut what farming is there and might be encouraged there in the recovery after, say, a drought. It turns out, in other words, that cause and effect are more complicated when even palliative care is taken to a large scale. Move into public policy, and that issue of cause and effect becomes even more complicated. Yes, you can do more good by striking at the roots of something. You can also do harm by making a problem worse instead of better. You can have no effect, because when you're funding a public policy strategy, you're not funding a solution to the problem. You're funding a theory of the solution to the problem. Your theory may be right, your theory may be wrong, your theory may be just incorrect enough that you have no real effect whatsoever. You, therefore, can help a lot more than the soup kitchen. You can also help a lot less than the soup kitchen. We can develop examples if we really want.
I'll give you one example. In my world, around 2007, the Gates and Broad Foundations decided they wanted to inject education into the 2008 national election. And they proceeded to write checks totaling something like $60 million in order to make education reform a big deal in the 2008 election. And absolutely nothing came of it. Absolutely nothing came of it. Now, is it because they only started in 2007 to think about it and it wasn't long-term enough? But you can also ask yourself what else might have been done with $60 million and so forth and so on. All right, now you promised examples.
Yeah.
He promised examples.
All right, so I'm going to offer one in a spirit of bipartisan, philosophical playfulness. I'll give you an example of, I think, all right, so a public policy that, if it's based on the wrong theory, can actually not be nearly as helpful as the donors would have thought. I'm going to take just a moment to deliver it. Indulge me for a second. It's become now a common thought among conservatives that higher education is, in part, its high costs are driven by the third-party payer problem. When government offers subsidized loans to people, it makes consumers less price sensitive. It makes them more willing to pay high and rising college tuition fees because they know that part of it's being covered elsewhere. And colleges are not unaware of this. They know that their customers are less price sensitive. They know why. Therefore, they keep raising tuition, and the subsidy just covers whatever colleges are charging. At least that's been the dynamic up till now. It's quite likely that those subsidies have, in their complicated way, exacerbated the problem of access to college, not by literally forbidding people from going, but by making it so expensive now that it's actually becoming a budgetary problem for the United States, and at some point they may start capping that. And I would only, and again, this is the spirit of playfulness part, point out that a similar dynamic of third-party payer dynamics has contaminated American healthcare financing. And what Obamacare largely does is to take the third-party payer problem there and double down on it by extending government subsidies to even more consumers who are therefore going to be less price sensitive. Hospitals and others, knowing this, are going to continue to jack up costs. And therefore, philanthropies that helped wanting to increase access to health care, who supported Obamacare, may well end up getting the opposite of what they wanted: increasingly expensive health care, which over time is going to make access to it, including because of federal budgetary limitations sooner or later, more problematic, not less. Now, I don't want to pick that as an example of failure, because we actually don't know how this plays out over time. We don't. But that would be an example of a theory that may or may not be right. What if it's wrong? That could end up being a choice that is regrettable instead of.
So Atlantic should have put its $24 million into education in 2008 instead of instead of health care, and then at least you would have done no harm.
Right, exactly. So, I want to say a couple things that partly pivot off that, but also the earlier part of the conversation. So, it's in the popular imagination, well, in the conservative imagination anyway, George Soros is some demonic, figure. But the fact is, having worked for Soros for 11 years, his ideology and politics are a lot more complicated than one would think. And in fact, he likes to do mostly charitable giving. So does Feeney, by the way, who I work for. Both of them have a strong bias for being able to see some impact, on actual human beings. They believe in policy funding, but they feel more comfortable if most of their money is going to, if you will, palliative things. Soros, in particular, is a very big thinker about unintended consequences. And so within the foundation, he's more about the kind of search for truth and doubt, than he is about certainty. And so he was always pushing back on us with public policy things about unintended consequences. And the problem with almost any large-scale public policy solution, whether it's in education or healthcare or campaign finance reform or whatever, is that those systems, find a way to be gamed, and what you thought was a way of solving something creates another set of. That's not an argument against to never do anything. I'm just saying it's part of the thinking of a guy like Soros. I wanted to say, with respect to the micromanagement issue, Gerard said, well, where does that lead one? Because of course a donor can't just be on autopilot and has to exercise some judgment and discretion, and that really at the end of the day is what philanthropy is about. You're exercising the judgment of where you put money or where you withhold money. So there is the ultimate ability to withhold a grant. I think with respect to what a group is doing, there ought to be some kind of if you will, negotiation up front about what success will look like that is shared and is largely driven by what the group says it wants to accomplish rather than imposed in some arbitrary way. But I want to give one example about the way that worked from Open Society and also from Atlantic. An example that may resonate with some people and perhaps not with others. That's to do with the death penalty. You can look at it as a subset of the criminal justice issue, but it's kind of sui generis. So, we're, again, foundations I've worked for, myself personally, are against capital punishment. How do you get to abolish capital punishment? And when we came onto the scene in the mid-90s and tried to think a little bit about how to spend philanthropic resources along to move away from the death penalty, we looked at the landscape of groups that were working, and we did not think that most of them had an effective strategy. Now, part of that is because there was almost no money in this field, and nobody had any real room to think about it. But you had either people who were purely, well, in this sense, palliative, who were lawyers who were trying to save individual people from execution, which is important, but not system-changing. Or you had what I would call the candle holders, people bearing witness outside the death chamber and so on, and chanting and singing songs, which is morally, important, but didn't do much.
This is a longer story than we'll have time for today, but we looked at what was going on and where the best ideas were and decided that we wanted to support the growing movement toward using doubt about the death penalty. I mean, you could look at this as big government going wrong also, but, you know, the Innocence Project and the whole DNA and the exoneration of people on death row who would have been executed but were found not to have committed the crimes. And we thought that the zones of doubt about the actual operation of the death penalty would be the best route. And we funded a variety of things toward that end. And I think if you look at the way the needle has moved on the death penalty over the last 10 or 15 years, 7, I think, states with moratoriums, death penalty has fallen into more significant disuse even in this even in this state.
Even in Texas.
Even in Texas. You have my former debating. I used to run the ACLU in Texas, so this is kind of a return to old stomping grounds for me.
And you still have a visa to get in?
I do.
Okay.
And Sam Millsap, who was the district attorney of Bexar County, who was a frequent debating partner, later came out against the death penalty. You have a lot of that kind of stuff. If you look at the way that needle has moved, it has been driven, I think, largely by the strategy that we invested in. That doesn't mean we micromanaged it. It means we decided to take a position on what the right approach would be, and we didn't fund some of our friends who had the different strategy, and that was not so popular, but it was more effective.
Let's see if
One second. As soon as he's done with his next comment, Gerard, the floor will be open, so prepare. Go ahead.
So, let's see, Gara, whether we put it the same way.
Yeah.
My instinct is that if an organization is going to largely do what it does, its people believe in it, they've crafted their strategy, they're built a certain way. What you shouldn't do is try to reach into that and alter what they do in some profound way or think that you're going to enlighten them. You should use your discretion to decide, is that model the one I believe in, or is this one the one I believe in? And your discretion matters in a bit like investing in companies and saying, this one just makes more sense to me than that one does, as Innocence very understandably and I think persuasively did for you. But what is not going to be the case is that you should be expecting to reach out in Innocence and say, now that I'm giving you money, let's sit down and let me tell you how to do what you do better or well, rather simply, that's the horse I'm going to back.
No, I agree with that, but I also think with respect to the horse, and this I think is something where there could be substantial left-right alignment. Over the years that I've been doing this kind of work, I've come to believe that the critical ingredient, I mean, there are a lot of ingredients, but the critical ingredient is leadership, right? And so I would much rather invest in an organization that was well-led and was able to flexibly deal with changing circumstances than in a strategy that might have to be revisited, you know, in light of changing events. I think over time, the investment you make in people is probably the set of skills involved in deciding who is the right person to carry something out is often a really critical and sometimes overlooked aspect of philanthropy.
Okay.